So welcome to our webinar on how to solve your upskilling problems by designing learning ecosystems. If you don't know me, I'm Robin Pettit, the founder of Sprout Labs. I'm the host of the Learning Way Working podcast. Before we move any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm joining from today, the Mulini people of Litwita. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands we're joining from today. I'd like to pay my respects to all traditional owners, present, past, and emerging leaders as well. If there's actually any community members here, I really want to pay my respects to you as well. A bit about Sprout Labs. Learning ecosystems are at the core of what we do. And it's interesting for us, it's both as a learning design thing as well as a set of technologies. We sort of alternate between with our webinars about talking about learning design and learning ecosystems, and then technology and learning systems as well. So do generally take a fairly digital focus on learning, so that will be a strong part of what I am talking about today. There's lots of other content from Sprout Labs on our website. I'm just going to highlight one of the things that I do is host a podcast, and I actually find that when I talk, a lot of the time the examples and the ideas actually come from those conversations on podcasts. There's particular moments when you hit there and say, "Oh, that Toby person that Robin talked about sounds interesting." You can actually then dive into the podcast with him and listen to more on what he's saying. Or Sonia as well. There's another one in this particular one as well. So this is a rough guide to what we're talking about today. Like many things, as you prepare things expand and contract as you get into them, and they're also reordered a little bit as well. Our sessions will be fairly interactive. It's not so much microphone interactions. It's a lot of it's text-based and using the stat tool on the whiteboard as well. So, if for some reason you've never used Zoom before, and I still feel like I need to do this because there's lots of people, actually as I was looking at some of the people, I sat there and went, "You're a frontline worker. You don't work in front of the computer all the time. Your organization also uses MS Teams on Zoom. So I'm still going to do my crash course. So just make sure you've got your participant list open so you can see who's here. And then also make sure you've got your chat window open as well. Just so you can take part in the activities that are coming up. So your interface then looks like this. Just a reminder, everyone, to make sure your chat messages do go to everyone as well. I want to do a quick exercise. I want to see what people want to get from this session. So if you can chat, could you just actually quickly write in what you want to get from the session? Some people fill out the form as they're coming in. Not everyone does that. So I'll just get my chat up so I can actually see it a little bit better. Cool, Cass, you want a clearer idea of what the learning ecosystems are? Broader ideas behind your normal ideas to inspire? Hopefully I do that, Aaron. Hopefully it's not too much wacky ideas. Cool. Rachel, yep, some things about how to explain innovative solutions, product ended. That's an interesting one, Luke, in terms of the productivity gain. Because sometimes what am I actually talking about is essentially ways of making the current strategy that people use for upskilling more effective and more likely to actually create outcomes. Cool. All right, thank you, everyone. I'll keep that in mind. And Jeff, probably the first half is really about upskilling and the way of what I'm seeing at the moment in the clients. And then the second half is the learning design part of it. Thank you, everyone. Now, in the nature of fairly interactive session, I'm going to talk a little bit about ways that I'm seeing that upskilling is important. But in your organizations and your situations, why do you think upskilling is important now? In chat, can we just please share this again? It's a really interesting thing because there's a lot of different ways. Cool. World's changed and we need to change with it. Yes. Big C word. That's what I found myself self-taught all the time when I was putting together the slides that summarize this was a change word. Change world. World. Cool. Aaron, safety. Yes, that's it. And safety is an interesting word. It's sort of shifted quite a bit. Cool. Pace of change again from Jeff. Staying relevant, shifting towards micro-credentialing. I'll pick up on micro-credentialing in a little while Rachel as well, because that's interesting for a few different reasons. Cool. Keep people interested in what you're doing. Yes. In this part of the world, we haven't seen the great resignation, but we do have engagement issues starting to happen. Cool. All right. So Cattle, hopefully I pronounced your name right, so that you're in the spot where you're both involved in what I'm thinking of as reskilling and upskilling. So I'll dive a little bit more into that as well. As you all said, work's been changing. If we haven't noticed, it's not just actually where we're working; it's actually how we're working in a very different way. And it's keeping on working on changing way more rapidly than what we ever suspected, say 5 years ago. I've been finding myself coming back to this quote by Joss Bersin, which was 2020, during the middle of the pandemic, and I still keep on sitting there thinking this is very relevant to where we're at now. It's essentially that work's now all about empowerment, safety, development, and agility. It's interesting because we in L&D and learning are involved in the development part of that. That quite often then gives people more empowerment, helps them make them to be more agile and cope with change, and helps them feel safe in their workplaces as well, and secure and being able to work in a really powerful way. So I think about this as a layered thing, and I think this is actually everyone picked up on these things. We've got these 3 layers at a personal level. We need to keep people engaged. We are all rethinking how we're working, why we're going to work, what are our drivers to go to work. A lot of people are actually in the spot where one of the biggest drivers is growth, and the reason to leave an organization is that they're not growing. We've also seen especially in the Australian context, it's really challenging to find the right people, especially in what I later on talk about as the emerging perishable skills. Everyone wants the same skills, and they're not things you can sit there and do a day workshop on and be an expert in. They take time to develop the types of expertise. It's really interesting to change word, because I think there's 2 major drivers actually, it's interesting even across this week. I'm just going to say all of our unknowns are increasing. I think it's been a really great example of a chaotic week in all of our lives in terms of weather and conflict as well. So we're all in this spot where change is actually at the front of our mind now. At Sprout Labs, we have this mantra of learning while working. I actually now see this is actually our new norm in this situation, where we're in this spot where we're changing. At a core level, what learning is about changing what you're doing and being ready for change. Been really interested in the moment, and I will do some more work on this about habits. We form, and humans are habit machines, and quite often it's quite hard to change our habits. And the actual neuroscience to do that is really interesting, how we can rewire our brain for change. But it's not something that actually comes easily. In a recent webinar, Britt Alexander talked about the fact that you need to practice a new skill, when you're changing, up to 60 times before it's built in. And it was like, whoa, Britt, how do you do that in a course? Because that's a lot of practice. And her reaction was, you don't do that in a course, Robin. other thing about this change thing was I was doing this, and I just wanted to really flag it. Not sure if anyone, I don't think I've heard anyone in the last 2 years talk about popularisation skills. It's not something that's in our language anymore. It's really interesting. It's something that's we're in a spot where we're all changing more often and becoming more agile. So it's not part of the lexicon at the moment. It's an interesting shift I wanted to flag. I hinted before this idea of these new types of upskilling skills as being two types of things. And this comes from a podcast with Sonia Maguk. She works at IBM doing essentially capability development internally and with their clients as well. And she introduced me to this really nice way of thinking about it, of skills as being perishable skills, specific technology or process skills. Internal skills are also quite often perishable, and then durable skills. The things that are really last a lot longer, are universal, really help to develop our mindsets and ourselves as humans. And I just find it a really interesting way of thinking about what the nature of a particular skill is. These lists of skills that are sorted into perishable and durable skills comes from the World Economic Forum Future of Jobs reports. So essentially, these are a set of durable skills that keep on emerging and being seen by chief HR officers of the future skills. And then the increasing demand are the skills that are becoming more important. At first glance, you sit there and go, oh, they're all tech skills. And then you sit there and go, actually, some of them aren't tech skills. Business development professionals, digital marketing and strategy professional things are not particularly tech skills. They're actually more strategy skills. As I said before, none of these are things you can go off and do a one-day course and expect from a one-day course to be a software and application developer. So they take time to develop as well. If we start in this upskilling initiative to focus on perishable skills, what do you think are some of our risks in L&D? I just think it's a really interesting one because quite often we sit there and go, what does the organisation need? Responsive, pedal away to make sure we get there. And it was interesting because keep on having people say, once we get there, it's changed. The initiatives and what's needed by the time we actually roll out the course within 3 months is actually, it's different. And it keeps on shifting as well. It's interesting to hear from the audience in the group. Oh, not prepared for future skills. And succession planning. And lack of real development of those core skills. The things that I think about it as almost durable skills or what keeps us strategic, moving forward, looking forward. And the perishable skills are the things we need on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, and the tech keeps on changing. So as soon as you sit there and go, one of the things with cloud computing, as soon as you sit there and go, yes, it's actually this type of cloud computing, it then sits there and goes, well, the approach has changed to here, and then that actually shifts, and we wasted all of that effort on that as well. Cool. Yeah, and it just keeps on shifting and changing. So it's also this thing about the investment, about whether or not the types of quick and easy upskilling that you can do for some of these types of perishable skills is quite important because essentially you need to make sure your investments are really your investments align for their actual time frame as well. One thing one of our clients is doing, as they were doing their strategic planning with their exec about their learning and development strategy, they actually produced and sat there and said, what do we need for the future of this organisation? It's a strong engineering organisation with lots of frontline people doing lots of fairly manual work because it has to be done that way. And they went to a whole lot of perishable skills, a whole lot of highly technical skills. And essentially what happened was the L&D manager put up these skills and sat there and went, let's do a dot voting exercise. And they went, okay, all right, in actual fact, critical thinking and analysis work is actually really important. Oh, yeah, that could really transform our safety programs, couldn't it? If people were more critical and better at doing risk analysis, that could be really transformative. So what they've then started to do is speculative development. They're sitting there going, it's not something we actually don't have so much a need for this. This is something that will improve the way we're doing. So they're doing sort of little prototypes of some of these things, just to sort of give a taste of what it might actually work and how it might transform them as well. So they're testing the ground. One of the things I want to explore was the difference between upskilling and reskilling. So I think we get them confused. They still have the skilling word in them. They're actually both about change, but quite different changes. So the reskilling one is probably the one I'm just going to focus on that, as it's quite often this moment where you actually have people that don't have the capabilities that you need anymore. And you're really helping people find that next role within the organization because of a restructure or different types of automations. And it's really sort of moving them forward to a different spot or helping them out off board as well. Upskilling is quite often quite different. It's quite speculative. It's sometimes unknown. It's actually not. You sometimes sit there and say, okay, let's upskill these people in this particular type of new technology or new way of working. And it might be useful. It might be something we do. But it's almost that whole sense. The upskilling is actually to try to figure out whether or not it is actually something that the organization wants to do and needs to do. Another thing from the podcast. I had this great conversation with John Darrett. John's not someone you sit there and go, oh yeah, I know that name as a learning professional or a tech professional. Essentially, before Google, he founded a company that was doing banner ads. He sold it before the dot-com boom happened, and then decided to go back and teach. So he actually went back to, and he essentially never really having to ever work again, but went back to teaching. So after about 3 years of teaching, he said, okay, I'm going to get into the business of running schools. So he actually started to work and fund and support charter schools in the US. He now runs a one-man venture capitalist firm doing ed tech work as well. So it's sort of interesting. This particular conversation was about pipelines, had 2 layers to it. It was one, the problems that he was seeing in his organizations that he was coaching and working with, and then 2, also some of his companies were also doing skills work as well. So it's interesting. So he was this idea that we all need to take responsibility for our talent pipelines. We can't sit there and say, yes, someone else is going to be able to do this. So he sort of thinks about this as quite often new partnerships with educational providers. And in two different ways. You grow your inexperienced people who are maybe not university graduates, a really diverse group of people, and you have new partnerships with educational providers to bring them into the organization. The new Cert 3 in IT actually has competencies around creativity, problem solving, and coding. This is traditionally a qualification that's entry level support people, so it's a really different type of work. And then the growing people as well. I will talk a little bit later about the rise of base camps as well. Of bootcamps. The 2 things that universities especially doing to make this easier for us in workplaces to engage is way better short courses, and then helping us with micro-credentialing, measuring and assessing people's skills as well. So that essentially it's a different sort of spot as well. Cool. Patrick, I just realized I missed your question about upskilling and reskilling at different stages of an organization. Yeah, there's probably a moment where if an organization's is moving to a different way of working and knows what that different way of working is, probably a moment where it's actually a reskilling rather than when they're figuring out what that new thing is upskilling. Cool. Sorry, Cass. I'm good at sometimes jargon. Micro-credentialing is a word that's being used quite often in the university sector. So rather than giving a qualification, and it's quite often by recognition of prior learning, and it's to sit there and say you have a skill in ... that's quite small. It might be something that in terms of it's not a full qualification. It's not even what would normally even be a university whole course. It might be something that's sort of quite small in terms of what it is. But it's measuring it fairly effectively as well without the normal bureaucracies we have to deal with when we deal with higher ed. Yeah, and I find it really interesting, by the way. It's actually all the universities that I see that are doing this really good way of rethinking this is that, in actual fact, they're all quite often Victorian based. So RMIT, Deakin, and Vic Uni are all the unis that come to my mind in the Australian context. They're actually doing that type of work. Cool. Jenny, I'll explore that in a few moments. I'll get everyone started on. I'm interested about this question. I just decided, rather than presenting my ideas on this one about how hybrid workplaces are changing upskilling, to actually do it as a question. So I'm actually really interested to see what your thoughts are. Cool. Okay. So that was Vic Wellington, Anna. Yes, cool. All right. Sorry about that. I presumed it was Vic Australia. Cool. Okay, so Jenny, essentially, quite often an organisation, when they're sitting there going, we need a new way of working, an organisation will do, and I am seeing organisations doing speculative upskilling. I'm going to use the cloud computing one again. We need to move to cloud computing. We don't know how that's going to work and what that really means, but we're going to run every person in our technical operations team through a Amazon Web Services certification. We doubt that we don't know what we're really going to do with it, but we just know we need to do something different. But we don't have the capability to even decide how we're going to do it differently. So that's the sort of thing that I'm meaning. Cool. And I've got crickets on this whole hybrid workplaces are changing, upskilling. It's interesting. Sprout Labs has been a hybrid place for a little while, and my thing is that for quite a while, actually, most of our clients are remote. It means everything has to be digital first. Essentially, you can't be in that spot where you sit there and go, oh, we'll bring some people in to do a workshop, because all of a sudden you sit there and go, who's in the office that day? Oh, we can't do it that day. Oh, will we bring them in remote? And then you sit there and go, actually, it's easier if everyone sits at their own desks and we do that facilitated session remote. Then you sit there and you go, okay, do we really need to do a 6-hour MS Teams or Zoom session? Oh no, look, in actual fact, there's a way better blended or ecosystem approach. And the other thing is, for me, is it used to be driven by learning designers sitting there saying, the best way to deal with this particular capability is in a self-paced way, and this particular way is the best way to deal with it in a facilitated way, and quite often no one would listen to us. Now, it's actually quite often driven by the employees who are sitting there going, actually, do we really need to listen to a lecture? Can't we just see this beforehand? Because people are so much more digitally literate, so they actually have different expectations of our learning as well. Cool. Learning design challenges. This is where I actually am going to. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts on upskilling actually are in terms of learning design challenges. Um, these three things are actually the things that we're seeing around the learning design challenges. For someone who's actually incredibly passionate about learning by working in informal learning, this is one of those times when I actually think it's one of those times when quite often formal learning is actually needed as well. Cool. I just realized I haven't scrolled down in my chat. So, yep, broader skill set. Cool. More Teams, Zooms, and rather reliance perhaps. And that was probably in a hybrid one, Cass. Nice observation, by the way, Patrick. Anyone interested in this particular one? Well, Beth, yeah, easily transpose. It's yeah. So it's interesting. Interesting. There was one particular conversation after the conversation on the podcast where someone who was working in a tech company and said, "But by the time we actually design a course, the organizations decided to do that differently." And it's just a really interesting moment to sit there and go, the easy trainable skills are no longer there anymore. They're repetitive and things, because essentially what we're talking about is quite often a whole lot more complicated in its nature as well. Okay, I'm going to keep on moving on. So what we need to be able to deal with some of these problems of taking formal courses, which are hard to actually get practice in, is really well-designed learning ecosystems. I now think of what's actually happening in our workplaces as three shifts. Employees become self-directed learners, managers become learning leaders, and L&D people become learning ecosystem designers. People like yourselves think about your learning landscape and design learning landscapes. Oh, that's not the slide that I wanted. Okay, so L&D learning. My definition of a learning ecosystem is it's made up of things that work together. It's actually when you bring things together that's where the power happens as well. The learner has some choices. So quite often in each part of the learning ecosystem, when you put a strategy in place, you might put multiple strategies in place so learners can actually feel like they have that empowerment to be able to do things the way they want to be able to do it as well. We are that old self-directed, and we quite often do go back to formal learning experiences. We do sit there and bring all those baggages we sometimes have about formal learning. So what does this mean for us as L&D people, to try to regroup on my sequencing? It means that we design more than courses, and we think about those relationships between the components. If we're putting together a series of job aids or a learning guild, how does that work with the other things we're doing? We do take account of the current learning landscape as well. It's really important. You have to be in the spot where you sit there and you go, what do people really need in this particular spot? So that example I used of that L&D manager who puts those lists of future skills, durable skills up to vote on, he said that it wasn't a particularly easy moment because everyone sat there and went, what planet are you on? This is not us. We don't do creativity. And it was when they started to translate it back to, okay, critical analytical skills are actually to do with our safety programs and embed our safety programs. And safety was incredibly important to this organization that they then started to click. Design for the long term as well. One of the things that's sometimes a challenge from a learner's perspective when they have choice is not knowing where to start. So actually thinking through how to guide people through these types of spots where they have different choices about how they go about doing things. It is really important to things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Sprout Labs learning design model. I'm going to dive in for the next half an hour is going to be going into each one of these and a little bit more. And then I'll explain the squiggle as well. So your learning ecosystem is connected using pathways. Pathways can be things like lists of links, diagrams, formal pathways as well, and formal skills for different organizations. I actually think the most powerful pathway is to give people an assessment, to sit there and say, your pathway, when you get to ... spot, that's where you need to be at. So you set the performance into the future, and then people raise to that performance. There was a bit of research that showed that if you actually, in a course, showed and demonstrated what the actual outcome was that you really wanted people to do differently, most people would sit there and go, oh yeah, cool, I can do it a new way. So it's this whole thing about being really clear about what the outcome is. I'm going to jump around to foundations for a moment. Foundations and learning's linked to knowledge. We need our knowledge supports. Quite often the only way in an organization you can access its know-how is through the learning experiences. We need to get that out of those spots into spots that are more flexible for learners to be able to get in and get access to them. It's also this thing that's linked between the fact that you have some knowledge and then you make your behavioural change as well. And to make that behavioural change, you need to have hothouses, places to rapidly practice your new skills. There was that podcast I talked about a few moments ago, and it's been a couple doing back-to-back on some brain science stuff, is the best way to put it. And both of them end up talking about the need for practice and the need to make sure that's the thing that really cements new behaviours in for us as well. So this means your learning experiences become a very different interactive things and different ways of working with people. We're social. It's interesting during this sort of spot where we've become more remote and the importance of that connection is really, really important to people. Cool. A couple of examples of foundations. Libraries of videos about different aspects of practice. Job aids, policies and procedures could be seen as foundations as well. Traditional good old handbooks could be seen as a foundation. So things that are essentially information. Cath is probably the best way to put it. Knowledge bases. There was an interesting conversation. Someone between two participants in a session that was online facilitation, and we were talking about software training, and someone sat there and went, "Oh no, all of our knowledge base is terrible. We have to redo all the screenshots for our training." And someone just sat there and went, "What? Why don't you just rework the knowledge base?" And it went, "Oh, no, we have to rework all this is terrible." It was like actually getting back to your actual how to use the system and fixing that is actually a really fundamental thing. So hopefully that solves that helps that with Cat. So learning, gardeners, we need things from each other. I actually find, and I'll say it probably a couple of times, and some of the examples I use a little bit later, the hothouses, gardeners and streams all mixed together in a really interesting and different way. So streams, last but not least, we need ways of learning in the flow of work. So we're actually improving what we're doing. Didn't actually say at the beginning, this is a series of webinars on different functions of L&D. The first one was on onboarding, this one's on upskilling, and the third one's going to be on innovation. So it's interesting. The onboarding one, the learning design approach has all started with the streams, learning in the flow of work. You're onboarding to a new organization. You're in a spot where other people around you are doing things. So you can actually be in a spot where you can actually copy what they're doing. With upskilling, it's actually different. It's actually probably more like a lot of what is traditional work we do in learning and development. It needs foundations and hothouses to practice, then to connect and actually transfer it into actual real behavior and to build up understanding with others. You need to do that with other people to be able to build that. You need your support from your managers as well. And then finally, once you're actually starting to do the new skill and new practice, that's where you can start to improve on it, and you can actually start to work and learn in the flow of work. A quick activity, because I'm about to just dive into a bit of a rant for three or 4 minutes again. So I thought it'd be nice to have an activity, and this would be really. I think it's a nice bit of sharing to see what some of your in the group, what some of your current upskilling priorities are. Jenny, yes, that the peer mentoring is essentially a really lovely bit of gardening, of structured gardening, bringing people together. Cool. Interested to see what some of people's upskilling things are at the moment. Cool, Alison, you're in a spot with leadership development, so essentially core durable skills, accreditation of roles, Jenny, new ways of working, which just really interestingly, I think we're going through actually a different shift to what we've gone through. Cool. Okay, yep. And Kath, you've got a couple of personal things, learning more about your actual work health and safety and your learning management system. Cool. We've got a few people, communication, and this is really interesting. Got quite a few here. They're actually the durable skills. Cool, Jeff. Yeah, you're working in that spot of actually getting more perishable skills. Cool. Interesting, Rachel, because that's an interesting mix of durables and something that could be seen as perishable, but seen as tactical as well. Cool. Thank you, everyone. The scenario we're going to follow through is actually a perishable skill. I had real trouble deciding whether or not it was going to be a perishable skill or a durable skill. So it's actually a tech skill as well. So meet Felix. We're going to help Felix design a learning ecosystem. It's essentially about helping his tech team and digital team really become better at cybersecurity. They're doing that thing that I hinted at before, taking everyone through a program. But then some people's roles might shift, but not everyone might actually do it, because they said, oh look, we just need to make sure everyone's got the skills, but we'll later on we'll develop some real actual experts in this as well. We're going to be using the Zoom whiteboard for most of these activities. So if you could go to the view options up the top of the screen, should be somewhere up here. Press view and then come down to the annotate menu. I'll just pause for a moment while you do that. Then we're going to use a tool. It's called the stamp tool. So you'll get a bar across your screen that looks something like this. If you're working on an iPad or a mobile, it might not work. I don't think it works. Just a few people, if you could just press the stamp tool on the screen to make sure I know a few people are actually in a spot that they actually are able to use it. Cool. Got a few people. Just need a few people to be able to actually get this happening. Ooh, lots of stars and ticks. when I was doing my dress rehearsals this morning, for some reason I decided to be negative and used um, used crosses. Cool. All right, I'm going to clear the screen and we're going to move on to our next thing. So I'm just going to dive in for a little while to talk about content libraries. Content libraries are quite often used in these types of areas with those perishable skills for lots of really good reasons. The one story from one organization that, and actually while I'm talking, could you put a stamp about whether or not your organization is using a content library, or your learning experiences are custom? So if you've got something like LinkedIn Learning or Go One, you're using content libraries. Are you putting it up the top and then, or you're putting it down the bottom? Cool, lots of people. So there's one really lovely example, was a L&D person had got a request for someone to do a project management course. It was clocked in at $15,000 per person, and I wanted to put 3 people through it. And they said, look, there's this LinkedIn course over here. It's 3 hours. It's an introduction to this particular methodology. Can you have a look at that? And they went back and they did it. And they checked in and sat there and went, actually, we've got what we needed now. We know what we need. And the only person walked out of it and sat there and went, okay, that's paid for the license in itself in 1 year with just that one action. So it can be an incredible saving around some of these perishable skills. It's interesting. This is actually about what I see with our clients. About half the people have one, and half the people don't have one. And it's interesting. I'm going to be interested to see whether or not, after I talk a little bit more about whether or not it is actually something you feel like you do need or don't need. Let's talk through some pros and cons, and then actually how we can get around some of those. As I said before, it's great for affordable way of getting new knowledge into the organization. Great for perishable skills. It's got this lovely moment. Increases the flexibility about what learners can do and what managers can ask people to do. So it just has that feeling of having an abundance of learning experiences in an organization. And that's quite a powerful spot to be in. The pros, generally, these are big things. They need to be curated. They need to be selected. They need to sit there and go, well, these are the things that are relevant to us. I'll talk about some strategies about that in a few moments. They need to be sort of selected. And most organizations don't feel like they get the full value from them. That particular client I talked to before, their content library, uses him as one of their reference clients because he is so happy with what he's been able to achieve with that content library. But most people are in the spot where they're actually at this spot where they're actually getting 30% of people actually using it, not let alone completion. So it's quite a low percentage of organizations. And that's what we see from data, by the way, with our clients. It's not what comes back from the content libraries salespeople. It's quite different to what they talk about as well. So some of the other thing to add to this, and we do I do lots of reviews of people's learning programs and learning management systems, and I get to have this great time to be able to actually spend time with learners really reviewing things. I've never heard the learners be particularly excited about being told to do another content library course. I found myself really having to be careful about making sure I didn't actually. I listed multiple there because essentially I think they all have the same problems. From a learning design point of view, using these as just your knowledge foundations, they're quite often video-based. I'm a big fan of Udemy, partly because of the diversity of it, and so you can make different choices about different instructors, and the price point at that as well, because it's really cheap. But quite often it's just a subject matter expert talking for hours and hours on end. They don't have a lot of really good learning design, and then you have to build opportunities for them to practice. Interesting, one of our team members is here. He's a power learner. We had an intern in. I've given her some, her and him with this particular scenario, Udemy courses to get up to speed with some of the things we do. And Bikram sat there and went, "Don't just watch it. You need to do some things. You need to do this activity, that activity, get this project, do this." And he built a whole project for them around that as well. So that was really, really interesting as well. The video-based things do also have the accessibility problems as well. In the work we do, I'm very cautious to use video when video is needed, not because it's an easy way of getting something out of a subject matter expert. It's a really interesting one because it does create a whole series of issues. It's become a lot of people associate e-learning with video now. This is one reason why learning ecosystems needed. To talk about a very simple way of building a learning ecosystem around an existing resource is actually how Toby Newman talked about it. This particular time when he was doing this interview, he was working for HERE Technologies. They're the people who make the GPSs that are in modern cars. Really rapidly changing environment. So quite often they would content curate, choose existing things from libraries. This classic way of sitting there doing content curation is saying why this is important to the organization. But quite often they would then build a little bit of an experience around how this applies into this organization. So this particular technology works in this particular way. If it's a durable skill, this particular framework, then this is how we apply it in our organization. And it was very quick and rapid to be able to then give more context and possibly build more practice experiences around it as well. The other thing is in terms of the knowledge foundations is the rise of the internal bootcamps. Bootcamps across these sort of perishable skills have become a real common way for people to upskill themselves. People sit there and say, okay, I'm going to take 3 months off and I'm going to become a web developer in a bootcamp. And generally fee for service. They're very rapid. They have strong connections to industry. So 3 months is a lot quicker than a 3-year university course. So these rapid, intensive things where people take the time out. One thing I'm seeing is more use of these types of intensives where people are taken away from their actual day-to-day work for a long period of time to be able to develop skills rather than a week. It's a 3 months boot camp. It's just an interesting trend to see it being used by individuals and then starting to be applied by organizations as well. So, a bit of voting by numbers. Knowledge foundations. So Felix's problems is cybersecurity for his technical staff. What could be, use your stamps, maybe make 2 votes if you want to, about what might be you think is the best solution that you would suggest to Felix. Bikram in the background is trying to collect up these as well. So in a spot where we can take these and then show them all at the end. So I'm interested to see from the audience which ones you choose. Because I've been fairly negative on video-based content libraries, but they do have their positives as well. Cool. The curated links list. This reminds me, there was a particular. Yeah, I think you can choose more than one option. I can't actually remember whether or not the stamp tool does allow you to do that, but I think it does. We're not getting very many virtual lunch and learns. It's interesting. Remember one particular presentation, but it was someone who was doing some work around was Jeevan Joshi and coming to some of the conferences that he was running. And he made the comment that quite often in his curated lists of things, tech, You'd have new people start and they'd find the same resources and share it back with the group, and I always got more engagement with those than anything. Cool. All right. I think we've got enough of an indication. So essentially we've got two sorts of strategies. The video-based courses, or three actually. The video-based courses, the curated list of links, and then the boot camps, internal and external as well. Maybe the videos and podcasts, which could sort of be go a little bit across that curated list of things as well. Not many people on the external formal courses, which is an interesting one as well. Cool. I'm going to clear my screen so I can move on to the next one. Hothouses. So time to practice. And this is really an interesting one. So again, I'm just going to talk about a few of these things as well. So essentially, it was actually quite hard to put these together for a couple of reasons. So user stamps as I'm talking. Tracking time spent. There was a particular interesting moment with a podcast person recently when we're talking about learning dashboards. And Eva Wed, it's about to be released over the weekend, went, actually, learning dashboards needs to track how much people are practicing, how much they're trying to do the work together. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Pairing, a few people are selecting. Pairing is actually quite a technical term that's used in tech to sit there and say you've got two people essentially doing the same job. What's actually been repeatedly found, it's not actually double the cost, because in actual fact, what actually happens is those two people working together are actually more productive than one person, and quite often they can actually be the equivalent of three people. The micro challenges are interesting, and there is a few cybersecurity things that are hanging around that are these sort of micro challenges that are spaced over a period of time. So they still do these simulations of things go wrong, and they're quite good learning experiences, which is lovely to see starting to happen in this spot. Chaos days are basically very similar to simulations. You have a whole series of things go wrong, and you respond to those. Cool. So we've probably got a really nice indication of pairing and micro challenges as well. Cool. Thank you. Move on to the next one. See how I'm going for time. The reason we need hothouses, I got my slides mixed around as well, is practice makes perfect. It was interesting on one particular, on Brit's podcast, she had a line about this. And this practice made perfect was actually posted by someone in a LinkedIn comment. And I just went, it's a really universal thing. So we do need to make sure we give people opportunities to practice. Practicing quite often away from actually doing the real work as well. Okay, gardeners. Interesting enough, some of these things cross over. So pairings on this one as well. It's a series of strategies that I've seen work. Guilds is a term that's quite often being used in this sort of digital upskilling for communities of people to come together to understand a new way of working. One of the reasons why the manager coaching toolkit's here is because it's not necessarily in a spot where the managers are going to be doing this. So it might be new knowledge that's coming into the organization, and you need a rapid way of being able to get people up and working. Beth, that's lovely. Practice makes progress. Growth mindset. Thank you. It's interesting. It's one reason why I want a couple of reasons. I love sometimes these participations because it's one of those moments where I go, actually, it's interesting that I deliberately use something that had come into my life from somewhere else. But that's a really lovely way to summarize two things. The whole notion that you need to do something to learn, but in actual fact, making progress is the most important thing. Thank you, everyone. So it looks like we've got group action learning projects and pairing Sometime I will dive a little bit deeper into this word called action learning, because it's one of those things I think, or actually one of those things I now know when I started using it, I was misusing it. It actually has a long tradition that goes back to the 70s with a strong framework. That's probably a little bit like what you're thinking, but it's got a really interesting set of um, ways of working around it as well. Cool. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, great. Beth, I think that's just a really lovely thing to share. Learning in the flow of work. So essentially, this is one of those moments where I just think this crosses over a couple of into essentially some of the things that could have actually been hothouses, could be gardening, could be gardeners or working with others, as well as streams of work. Streams of work quite often for me are about reflection and articulation and doing projects and stretching. But in this particular spot where the practice maybe is not there in the organisation yet, it just has a different sort of sense and feel to it as well. So it's actually the one I found most challenging to think through in terms of things. Got a couple of people talking about stretch, learning logs and blogs. It's interesting. Strategy I quite often use in instructional design. Not for everyone. I'm much to probably everyone's disbelief. I'm not a particularly good writer, but I do find that by writing, I actually quite often use it as a way of thinking and learning for things as well. Cool. So we've got a few different things starting to come out. So it's looking like the learning blogs, and the pairing becomes our strategies. It's interesting for a few different reasons. Cool. I'm going to clear this, and then hopefully Bikram in the background. And this one's the one that he needs a little bit more time to do. Oh, sorry, I haven't quite got there, Bikram. There was another one I forgot, which is actually interesting because I actually quite often start with this particular one of pathways. And even when I actually introduce the learning design model, it's in a spot where this was the first one I talked about. So because that's actually the way I think about it, is giving people pathways. But sometimes when you actually know, you don't always know that with upskilling, you don't always know where you're going, so the pathways become harder. So with some of these types of perishable skills, there's really great certifications are out there. There's the micro certifications we talked about before, but actually like full certifications that people can work towards as well. They're interesting because sometimes some of those certifications cover things that are probably not actually things that you're going to use every day in your organization. Sorry. Flipped through too many things quickly, and my internet's now just dying for a few moments. Yep, so capability frameworks, peer assessment, workbooks. Interesting how the learning while working in the stream one became about learning logs. I've just had a really series of quite transformational learning experiences that are based around workbooks. And also came up on the podcast recently. So there's actually a couple of different things we're starting to do around thinking about workbooks, which is almost like the way I'm thinking about it is actually learning logs in a structured way. So you're structuring the questions, you're structuring the reflection, and it's sort of transforming something that can sometimes be not active into something that's more has more practice built into it. So you can take, say, a passive video course. You, as a learning and development person, can build a workbook around that asks people to reflect on what their current skills in beforehand, what they've learned, what their actions are, how they're going to do things differently, so they start to track it and give that structure to the learning log as well. But there is a very different thing here, which is the capability frameworks. There could actually probably be, because if it's a new skill, actually learner build capability frameworks. So as people are starting to understand what something means for an organization, actually building what that might mean as well. Now I'll go into my next one. Clear my screen. Go to my next screen. Hopefully Paul Bedrooms had enough time to be able to do this. Cool. I'll go back into full screen, everyone. So these are some of the strategies that we've actually selected. And I think what Bikram's done is actually put the ones that are the top ones towards the left-hand side. So this sort of becomes our learning map of what our ecosystem becomes. Thank you, everyone, for helping trying to build that as well. We've got a few more minutes before we wrap up. I'd just like to do a quick closing, which is actually a quick thing about what have you learned today and how are you going to apply what you've learned today. So just bear with me for a few moments while I get my chat setting back up again. Well, Grace, yes, it's really interesting. I've also seen, I'm going to use an example of the leadership course I did at one stage. We were given a workbook that was essentially a series of readings. Now, when I'm seeing the sort of equivalent types of courses, the workbooks are actually very active, useful guides for self-assessment and planning. And that's a really, really different thing for things as well. Cool. Cool. Thank you, Jenny. Cool. Yep. Basically, what I try to do is I get very quickly quite broad, and with some of these things, and it's one of the reasons I have all the circles, is to actually give some people some tactics to be able to work through as well. Cool. Okay, Beth, that's great. You're going to share it a little bit more. Cool. See you later, Jenny. And I think we're at the spot where we're just about to the spot where we're going to have to wrap up. And so thank you, everyone, for a really interactive session, nice number of people, lots of great participation. Thank you so much, everyone, for a really good session. Probably won't get the recording and the resources out today. That probably will be tomorrow, just because the rest of the day is nearly all in meetings. So thank you, everyone, for a really good session. And nice to see some old faces and new faces, by the way, everyone.